Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker today. I need to give you a little bit of background. 11 years ago this month, I was serving on a search committee as we were working assiduously to find Dan Minchin. We needed someone with some significant professional experience who was willing to make the big leap into academia like a few of us have, to equip young, high-potential Christ followers for the workplace. And Dan Minchin stood out immediately as a colleague we were looking for. Like discovering new layers of an onion, and maybe that's a bad metaphor, I never stopped learning more about this man and how his rich background that God has developed in him is being used to equip him for doing good things with our students here. Let me give you some quick examples. Dan grew up in Buffalo. He served in the Army Security Agency for 3 years at Kagnu Station in Ethiopia. In the early 70s, he was a newspaper or news reporter and news director at radio stations in Buffalo and in Albany. And then prior to joining Xerox in '79, he was a Rochester radio and TV news broadcaster for WROC and WHAM. He's a graduate of Geneseo and later earned his master's in communication management from the Newhouse School in Syracuse. Dan worked his way up through at least 5 different positions in his 20-plus years at Xerox, and then took early retirement as the director of public relations for developing markets operations to start his now storied long commute from Rochester to teach at Houghton, where he straddles teaching in both business and the communication departments. Dan's produced videos about the work of the Wesleyan Church in Sierra Leone, and even an Attica prisoner rehabilitation project. He's been described as a compassionate capitalist by Richard DeVos. He's taught and lectured in Northeastern Seminary, SUNY Geneseo, the Newhouse School of Communications and RIT, and of course the now famous Houghton College. Tiny Houghton, as some called it recently. He served as a Presbyterian elder. He's an avid photographer, has taken students on our May term trip to New York City for 3 weeks. That alone should win him some kind of award. And then has taught in our adult education program, and of course many classes here on this campus, and now is a very active professor teaching online in our online coursework. More importantly, Dan is passionate about investing in his students and his 3 adult sons and their families, and most importantly, he's in love with his adventurous and lovely wife Sandra, who's joined us today, so we're glad to have her here. This afternoon we learn about another layer of Dan's fascinating interests in a fellow Buffalonian, William J. Kaiser, my colleague and good friend. Dan.
Thank you so very, very much for that. I forget about all those things you mentioned. It's been quite a few years. I mean, all my focus is here these days at Houghton. Thank you all very much for coming along today. I really appreciate you being here. I'm going to start. This is my little script. I'm going to have to read that. But I just want to ask a little show of hands. If you are under 30, please raise your hand. No, you can't. If you're under 30, do you remember, does anybody know about Henry Kaiser? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Henry Kaiser. You have, well, okay.
Well,
Jenna is my teaching assistant. That's probably where you heard about it. If you're over 40, have you heard about Henry J. Kaiser? Over 40.
of course.
Yes, there's been a few of us. Has anybody not heard of Henry J. Kaiser?
Oh, you're missing
Quite a
out
few
on the
people.
advertising.
Well, now this is your curative session because you now will have heard about Henry Kaiser and why I seem to be so fascinated in this person and have been for a length of time. For many years, I've had a strong interest in Henry Kaiser. He's the person who set up and ran the Kaiser Fraser Automobile Company in the 40s and 50s. He pioneered unique auto designs back then that were highly acclaimed. In fact, this one advertisement over here from a 1953 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, that was a magazine some of us remember, with interesting covers. That says, the ad says, that he won 14 international awards for his design of automobiles. 1953, he'd only been in business for a few years. And that's before they had a sports car, which also won designs. Well, as a child, my father drove a Kaiser as the family car. I was just a little kid. I was probably 3 or 4. And that was the car. The family car was the car. That was it, right? Before long, he bought another car, a Kaiser. Now, back then, people traded things in every couple of years, and that's kind of why that happened. And I saw the emblem on the car. It was right on the front. It had a nose on it, and it had a big K, which stood for Kaiser, and it had a buffalo on the bottom of it. See the buffalo? Mm-hmm. Well, since I lived in Buffalo, that sort of tied the two together. I saw a connection, nice city, nice car. Then my uncle showed up in a newer Kaiser. And driving home from church one day, I happened to see the most beautiful Kaiser I had ever seen. And I coaxed my parents on busy Kenmore Avenue. I said, please stop so I can get out of this car with my little Brownie Hawkeye camera and take a picture of it. And that is the picture from 1955. So to me, Kaiser meant cars. And I was shocked back then to learn that Kaiser had gone out of business. The reason given? He was ahead of his time. Now, I thought that was an advantage in business, to be ahead of your time, but I guess not. Kaiser cars vanished rather quickly from the roads. They were derisively called orphans. But the name Kaiser and the images happened to stick with me for a long period of time. Now follow me, probably 4 decades later, 40 years. I was on a business trip in San Francisco, and I'm walking up Market Street, and it just, whenever I see a bookstore, it's like a big magnet. I have to get in the bookstore, and I never walk out without something from the bookstore. I was thumbing through a table with hardcover books on it, and I happened to see this one, Kaiser. And it's funny because the owner of the bookstore came over immediately. This is honest recollection. He was so happy I had picked that book up. He said, I've been looking for the right owner for this book. You must be him. And I said, yes, I happen to know. This fellow was making cars. He said, oh, more than cars. Read the book. I walked out of that store with the book, and I voraciously read Foster's book, which I think is the definitive chronicle of this man's life. My curiosity was both piqued and it was satisfied at the same time. This, to me, was a new Henry J. Kaiser, and I began to read as much as I could about the man who was nicknamed Hurry Up Henry. Well, the first thing I learned about Mr. Kaiser was that he was far more than automobiles. In fact, in writing a summary of his life and accomplishments, I have found it difficult to pin a label on him. And Ben, I think, can verify that. I tried many different names for this particular lecture. I simply couldn't come up with one because it didn't contain enough of what I thought defined Henry Kaiser. Here's some of the things he's been called: an empire builder, the builder in the modern American West, a Western colossus, a miracle shipbuilder, a government entrepreneur, and one of the few great risk takers of his era. But actually trying to label him, the press and others chose the term industrialist. He was an industrialist according to them. Well, it's here on this commemorative sign in front of his birthplace. I always felt that this term was unfortunate because few people can relate to industrialist, and I think there's probably fewer who could accurately define what industrialist meant. His advertising people apparently had that same problem. In this Saturday Evening Post ad, right over here, the one with the sort of pink and the orangey, newscaster Lowell Thomas of CBS, now he was a big voice, he was the Walter Cronkite of his era on radio. He's pictured driving 10,000 miles in a 1953 Kaiser car, visiting 6 of Henry Kaiser's enterprises. I'll list them briefly. If you look at that ad, building Panorama City in the Los Angeles basin, Lake Levittown on Long Island, the concrete contractor and lead government negotiator of the Hoover Dam, the creation of Permanente Cement for paving. The ad says he produced enough cement to pave a 2-lane road all the way around the world, end to end. Kaiser Steel, a huge mill about 50 miles outside of Los Angeles that produced iron and steel for shipbuilding enterprises and construction projects. And maybe you know this if you have driven over the Oakland-San Francisco Bay Bridge, a creation of Mr. Kaiser's steel. Kaiser Aluminum and Kaiser Chemicals, Kaiser Metal Products. He fabricated metal for everybody else, just about everything, including the kitchen sink, which he put porcelain over. So it didn't look like metal, but it was a sink. And that does not include his shipbuilding, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So who was this man? Who did all this? Where did he come from, and what motivated him? What I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is try and explain it. To break down that term industrialist, give you an idea of who Henry J. Kaiser was, an outstanding entrepreneur and a businessman who is, I think, under-recognized here in the East. He's recognized a little better out West, but I think he's often forgotten in American business circles today. Fortunately, Henry's life is well documented, but he never did gain the spotlight as others did. There's been no PBS special on Henry Kaiser. The Harvard Business Review wrote a 28-page study of Kaiser, and it's a good one. But it wasn't until 2008, 41 years after he died. So his obscurity in my book lingered. Well, Kaiser was born in 1882 here in New York State in a very rural community called Sprout Brook, about an hour west of Albany. His parents were immigrants from Germany. His father was a mechanic who worked in the shoe business in Utica. His mother was what they called back then a practical nurse. They had 4 children. Henry was the only boy. Well, as a youth, Kaiser, and let me just say that in German his name means emperor, Kaiser was highly ambitious and quite capable. At 13, Kaiser quit grade school before graduation. He had no diploma his entire life. He started to work to support his family. His mother felt terrible about that. His father, we understand, had a drinking problem. Initially, he was a shy boy. He was full of self-doubt. He was afraid to present himself to an employer. I think it's the only time in his life he was afraid of anything. But by the time he was 20, Kaiser worked with a partner in a photography store in Lake Placid, New York, and he was making a go of it. He was fascinated with George Eastman's Kodak camera and making portraits of wealthy vacationers. He was also fascinated with the cold waters of Lake Placid itself, spawning a love for swimming and boating that lasted his entire life. Here's a plaque on Main Street in Lake Placid honoring Kaiser. I just was there a year or so ago finding this and taking a picture of it. It's tarnished, but you can still see it, and it is there today. Now, in Lake Placid, Kaiser met a well-to-do woman, and at that time, Lake Placid had a lot of very wealthy vacationers. Her name was Bess Fossberg, and he was taking her portrait in his Photoshop. He liked Bess, and he liked photography. The two of them went together pretty well, but he was quick to realize that his business died off after the summer season. Plus, if they were to marry, Miss Fossberg's father insisted that Kaiser get work that would pay the bills. So Kaiser headed south and set up shop in Daytona Beach, where the weather was a lot better, more favorable to taking pictures, but it still wasn't enough. Bess's father suggested that he try the West Coast, get him as far away from the East as possible. I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he thought out West he'd forget about his daughter. But Kaiser did indeed go out west, and he took a train. And he was absolutely fascinated with looking out the window, seeing what the West was like. He saw nothing but opportunity out there. So the train went as far as Spokane, and he had to get off of it. Gazing out the window, he saw opportunity. Well, in Spokane, Kaiser got work in a hardware store where he started as a clerk, but he really wanted to be a salesman. He paid a visit to a nearby construction site, and within days, he came back with a fistful of orders. And he was also called the man with the smile. That stayed with him through his life. The store prospered in a big way, thanks to Henry Kaiser. And he returned east, and he did marry Bess Fossberg near her home in Boston. And then the young couple went back out to Spokane. Wherever Kaiser went, this cheerful, energetic 8th grade dropout saw opportunity, not problems. The Northwest was opening up to more industry and settlement, and Kaiser sensed the problem of no roads or no good roads would lead to opportunity, and he was right. In fact, Kaiser had a phrase he used in conversation. He said that problems were only opportunities in work clothes. And to him, that really worked in his life. He left the hardware business and he joined a construction company, one that was clearing way to pave roads. However, due to mismanagement, that company went out of business in the middle of a road building project. Kaiser decided, out of business now, but Kaiser decided to stay on the job for 4 months without pay, just to finish the work, because he said he would do it. Well, news of this extraordinary, selfless decision got around, and his reputation for honesty and dependability and hard work absolutely soared. He'd gotten good at road building, so he decided to start his own business. He called it Kaiser Paving. He'd also gotten good at negotiating and winning. One of the bids he won was to construct a 200-mile-long road with bridges in Cuba. It was extremely hard work. Kaiser and his men fought drenching heat, deadly reptiles, and incessant disease-carrying insects, but they completed the job successfully, paving over swamps and clearing thick vegetation. It was the last contract he bid on in Cuba. One road was apparently enough. But there was plenty more work out west. Kaiser would learn of projects and would not miss the opportunity to submit a bid. He happened to be in Portland, Oregon one day when an associate informed him of a big California job where bidding was imminent. So his associate, D.F. Ordway, got tickets and booked a train to go from Portland, Oregon to Redding, California, where the bidding took place. However, after boarding, and to his great surprise, Kaiser learned that this particular train did not stop at Redding, but rather at a station down the track. That stop would have made him late for the bidding, so he and Ordway had to devise another plan. They learned that the train slowed down as it passed through Redding so a collector could hook a satchel that hung from a pole, kind of like they used to do when they took mail off those poles years ago. Kaiser and Ordway decided when it slowed down to jump off the train so they would not miss the bidding. It was still moving. As the story goes, the well-fed Kaiser was first to leap off the back of the train, and Ordway followed. Author Mark Foster says that Kaiser became a human bowling ball and wound up under a clump of trees. Ordway did the same. Disheveled and scraped and skinned, the intrepid contractors dusted themselves off. They attended the bidding and they submitted what was to become the lowest bid, and they won it. It was for a $500,000 contract, and this was the 30s. That's a lot of money. It's fair to say that Kaiser loved work, and he also loved working with people. Later in his life, he remarked that there was no such thing as labor relations. Instead, he called them human relations. He treated his workers fairly, too fairly, according to some others in similar businesses. He paid well, he gave generous benefits, he started the first HMO, the Health Maintenance Organization, for which he was accused of embracing socialism. His scheme was to have each worker pay a small amount of each paycheck for health benefits, and if and when they needed help, they would report to a clinic or a hospital. Kaiser owned both of them, clinics and a hospital, and the fee was covered. His generous wages annoyed East Coast business leaders who wanted to keep union pay scales in check. Kaiser's pay raises forced them to offer the same amount, leading to negative thoughts about the man with a smile who never finished grade school. They never let that line drop. In time to come, they'd also be annoyed with his PR work and how the press loved his toothy David Letterman-type smile and his amazing accomplishments as a shipbuilder and his other successes. East Coast rivals didn't get the same airtime. It's also fair to say that Kaiser cozied up to the federal government because, like Kaiser, the government wanted to do big things, especially out west. Remember the 1930s? It was a time of very high unemployment, the punishing dust bowl of the Midwest, sad photographs of destitute people. The government, especially under FDR, wanted to change things. So launching big public works projects was one answer. In the West, the collection and distribution of water was a major problem, and here again, Kaiser saw opportunity. If the West could be irrigated, the desert would bloom, he thought. If water could be harnessed, electricity could be produced. If an infrastructure could be created, companies would come. If contracts were signed, men would get jobs. Kaiser wanted this to happen, so there'd be more opportunities for him. And given his growing reputation and name recognition, this Easterner found his way into the largest construction businesses in the West. Partnering with such names as Bechtel and Morrison Knudsen, Kaiser became part of an enterprise that was called Six Companies, a special arrangement set up to bid on gigantic projects such as what was known then as the Boulder Dam that no one company could complete on their own. But with a consortium of experts in design, engineering, geology, drilling, blasting, steel fabrication, concrete preparation, and pouring, Six Companies was awarded the contract to build what is now known as the Hoover Dam, a colossus, as Michael Hiltzik has called it, and an iconic marker of what's been called the American century. If you've ever visited the Hoover Dam, you may have seen the dedication plaque on the road that crosses over on the top of the structure from Nevada into Page, Arizona. And on the plaque, take a look at it, you'll see the name in raised bronze, Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser was never seen as an arrogant man. He was no braggadocio, but he was very good at public relations. He didn't thump his own chest. Instead, he was the commander of his own enterprises, much like Captain Kirk in the original Star Trek series. He was also an avid self-promoter, although not an arm twister. He was a deft user of PR and the press. He hired PR men, no women yet, sorry, to scour opportunities in the nation's press, especially in publications such as Life magazine, the star of the Henry Luce empire, and they gave him favorable exposure. Matter of fact, right here in Houghton's library, I guess it's down there, which houses a collection of old Life magazines, there are about a dozen articles showcasing Kaiser from the 40s and 50s. He seemed to be a favorite, easy to get to, easy for reporters to quote, and most colorful. Kaiser was responsible for building numerous dams in the West, including the Bonneville, the Grand Coulee, and the Shasta. When he was working on the Shasta project near San Francisco, he was not successful, in getting the Southern Pacific Railroad to lower their rates enough so he could get his concrete mix from the concrete plant over to the dam site. That was a make or break dilemma. So Kaiser wound up building an almost 10-mile-long conveyor belt through mountains and twice over the Sacramento River to get his powdered concrete mix over to where they were pouring it on the Shasta Dam. Matter of fact, he did it before they actually needed it. They said, "Glad you got it here. We're not pouring quite yet. Slow the conveyor down a little bit." But when they needed it, the conveyor went up, the concrete was where it was supposed to be, and the Southern Pacific Railroad didn't make a dime on that deal. He'd gotten so much work and so much press coverage that it raised the suspicion of underhanded dealing. One biographer, his name is Dylan Davis Bloom, extensively researched Kaiser, expecting to find dirt under the rug and expose him in his writings. But after digging through Kaiser's business records, which are voluminous, at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, Davis Bloom noted, "I was surprised to find absolutely no documents accusing Kaiser of being a profiteer. In his time, he had a reputation for honesty and hard work, and investigations into his life have borne that out." Well, in the late 1930s, President Roosevelt was assisting the British, as you know, using Lend-Lease, and preparing America to enter World War II if necessary, and it became apparent that the USA did not have the floating arsenal that would be needed if Japan, an Axis partner, entered the war. The Pacific coast was vulnerable. And America's major warship builders and steel mills were all located in the east. Kaiser sensed opportunity. Because of his success in building roads and dams and coming in under cost and often ahead of schedule, and because of his honest reputation, Kaiser was awarded contracts to build ships both for the Merchant Marine and also for the U.S. Navy. He had never built ships before. He didn't own a shipyard, but he had a name and he had a reputation, and he landed one of the biggest contracts. Hurry Up Henry wasted no time establishing shipyards in Portland, Oregon, and across the Willamette River in Vancouver, Washington, and in Richmond, California on the San Francisco Bay. Henry Ford was known to history as the man who launched mass production using the assembly line, but Henry Kaiser adopted this method and used it in shipbuilding. Before Henry, it took months to produce an ocean-going ship, but with him, he was cranking out ships in about 5 days, actually less than 5 days, from laying of the keel to launch. He was helping to build, or at least vastly expanding, America's Pacific Fleet. There were times when Kaiser used his understanding of human relations to speed up production. He'd often pit teams of workers competitively against other teams of workers in a friendly way and offer prizes for those people who finished the job first. As such, he whipped up a lot of enthusiasm among his workers at his shipyards, and Kaiser, the man with the smile, always showed up to flash his big toothy grin and cheer on the workforce who happened to love Uncle Henry. He was very progressive in his hiring policies. Foster points out to get workers, Kaiser rented a train and they drove it all through the southern United States, and they asked people to jump on board if they'd like a job in Washington or Vancouver or in San Francisco, and they jumped on. Women were welcome, so were African Americans. Welcome, no discrimination here. Kaiser did his best to blend blacks and whites. That was his rule of work. He wanted to see people as people. In 1944, when Henry Wallace did not run for vice president on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ticket, Kaiser was considered for vice president. He spent 2 days up on the Hudson River at Hyde Park with FDR and his wife Eleanor, but he wasn't asked. Harry Truman was. Perhaps his German surname was too much for the American people. They were witnessing the bloody and costly war with Germany, and his name meant emperor. Had he run and won, however, and had FDR died as he did, Henry Kaiser would have been the American president. When the war began to wind down, Kaiser envisioned a change from shipbuilding. He knew that returning GIs would need homes, and hence he built Panorama City and some of Santa Clara too, north, but mid-California is where that is. But even more, they would need cars. American auto companies had not made cars since 1941, and because their factories were used to produce war material, they were without automobiles. So Kaiser decided that he would enter the automobile business. He partnered with an experienced auto executive, Joseph Fraser, and he hired a top-notch automobile designer, Howard Darren, and leased a former airplane plant in Michigan, and he opened Kaiser Fraser Motors. He was in business with a newly designed car in late 1946, a little more than a year after the war was over. To introduce that car, Kaiser held a press conference in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and soon after, sales began. The car was a hit. The 1947 Kaiser and the twin model Fraser sold more than 70,000 units, a launch that put America's big three car makers squarely on notice. Hurry Up Henry was hurrying up. Kaiser was delighted, but more sober-minded associates thought that he shouldn't smile quite so broadly. They warned him that Ford, Chevrolet, and Plymouth, with deep pockets from war contracts, they were planning to regain their former territory, and within 8 years, Kaiser's nameplate was history. He later admitted he had underestimated how much money it took to be in the car business. He came in with just $50 million. It would have taken at least 10 times that to establish a modest footing in the automobile business. So Kaiser wound up selling the rights to his most beautiful, this is the one I saw in Kenmore Avenue, his beautiful 1955 Kaiser to an Argentina enterprise favored by Juan Perón. Kaiser Industrias Argentina went on to produce that same car through 1962. Well, losing in the automobile business was a setback, and Kaiser was not used to setbacks. In his late 60s, he decided to focus on Hawaii, where he built a beautiful hotel now owned by the Hilton chain, and he launched a housing development called Hawaii Key. He also pushed his aluminum business with a commercial product, aluminum foil. Maybe some of you might remember one of the TV commercials. I'm going to play one right here. Next slide. Yep.
Don't move, because I want you to know this about Kaiser foil.
It's quilted.
This is the quilting in Kaiser foil. Whatever plain foil can do, quilted foil can do better. Because it's quilted, Kaiser foil has extra strength, more body. Because it's quilted, your cookies won't stick. Don't try it with plain foil. Because it's quilted, you can roll pie dough on it. With plain foil, it's difficult. And because it's quilted, leftovers are better protected. The quilting seals firmer. Tomorrow, ask at your store for Kaiser foil, broiler, household, and the new 7-inch.
If they haven't got it, you tell them to get it. They'll get it. Kaiser foil.
It's quilted.
Yet it costs no more.
Thank you, YouTube. Whoever Video Weirdness is, I don't know who that is, but somebody found that commercial. It was spliced together a couple times, as you can remember seeing that. That was an ad that played on network television. So Kaiser eventually retired in Hawaii and commuted back to California when his business enterprises there called him back. But in Hawaii, his wife, Beth, fell ill, and Kaiser moved her back to Oakland. Her illness resulted in her being bedridden, so Kaiser hired a full-time nurse, Alice Chester. She lived with the Kaisers, and when Henry was in town, she naturally was there too. He and Nurse Allie, her nickname, became friendly, shall we say. Bess died in 1951, and within a month, Kaiser married Nurse Allie. He was 69 years old. She was 34. Allie was attractive and young, both assets to the aging Kaiser, but she didn't enter into his business life. Bess was known and liked by many Kaiser associates, but Allie stood back. She was unfamiliar with what the famed businessman and entrepreneur had really done. Kaiser lived out his days in Hawaii, eventually yielding his businesses to his son Edgar. And after Kaiser died, Allie, to whom he bequeathed 1/2 of his $2 billion fortune, stepped back even further. He left the other half of his estate to Kaiser Permanente Health, and then he formed the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation. Allie Kaiser eventually moved to Greece and off the American news pages. Edgar Kaiser, the son, continued to manage the Kaiser businesses, but the glory days were gone. He was last known as the head of Kaiser Steel before the Fontana, California plant was closed and its equipment sold to China. His other industries, like him, faded away, except for Kaiser Permanente, the health plan, and the Kaiser Family Foundation. You can hear some of the medical reporting on PBS now and again, and Kaiser Aluminum, which continues in the aluminum fabrication business even today. And as a side note, Edgar Kaiser had a son, and that was Edgar Kaiser Jr. He was one of the owners of the Denver Broncos. And it was Edgar Kaiser Jr. who helped negotiate with Baltimore to bring John Elway to Denver, and to great acclaim. It was called the deal of the century. So how do we summarize the life of Henry Kaiser? Well, he was a daring and visionary entrepreneur who started more than 100 companies in his lifetime. An affable doer, a never-say-die type. He stepped up to challenges as if they were Goliaths to be slain. He was driven, and yes, he drove those underneath him, sometimes relentlessly. He was satisfied with accomplishment, and sometimes he seemed to believe that there was no challenge too big. Furthermore, Henry seemed happy. He genuinely enjoyed what he did. Kaiser was also, on occasion, not afraid to admit his shortcomings. In the auto business, he had ignored the advice of his associates that he didn't have enough money to compete with Detroit. But as David Halberstam reported in his fabulous book, The Reckoning, Kaiser said, and I quote, "My advisors were right, and I was absolutely wrong. We were always completely undercapitalized. Everything that went wrong was my mistake." For a proud and successful businessman, that remark showed Kaiser had a rare quality called humility. Kaiser was not overly religious. He attended an Episcopal church that matched his personality in that it was formal and it was orderly and organized. Whether he prayed personal prayers, I do not know. But I have my hunches, and here my Reformed background will show. I believe that Henry John Kaiser was called by God personally and gifted by God to perform an amazing task, to build a protective fleet of ships on the West Coast, which required all of his other businesses, including the steel mill, that contributed greatly to saving America from defeat and being consumed by a decidedly unchristian foreign culture. I believe Kaiser answered his call with a smile, and as a result, he was rewarded here on earth and elsewhere. And someday, I hope to meet this man that I've been fascinated with. And if I do, I suspect he'll be smiling. Thank you for your kind attention. if you have any comments or questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Go back to this picture of the sports car. You flipped over without saying it.
The sports car.
The sports car.
You want me
Yeah,
to
go
go to
back
that
to the
slide?
picture. What year was that?
Oh, the 55.
The green one?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a full-size car.
Yeah.
Oh.
That's actually a 6-passenger automobile. That's a
Yeah,
1955 Kaiser.
That's the last one.
55?
Yeah, they only made about maybe 20,000 of them. They didn't make many back then. I'm wrong. 2,000 of them. I get my zeros mixed up. They made about 2,000 of that model. But it was also the 54 that they made a lot more of. So they carried some over. That's when he decided to get out of the car business. It's a beautiful car. There's a Kaiser Frazer club too, and actually that's one that shows up at the club all the time. But you can, from 1955, you can see that's pretty nice. It had a cup steering wheel, pop-out windshields, leather seats, padded dashboards, had all the advanced features that came into being a lot later.
Just
Young what?
as a follow-up on that, on the automobile, what was Frazier's involvement with it again? He was-
Ah, yes. Joseph Frazer had been the president of Graham Page, which was an auto company that went out of business during the Great Depression. And so Kaiser coupled up with him because Kaiser didn't have experience in the auto business, so Graham Page did, and Joseph Frazer did. And so they decided they would make one model of a car, and it was called, well, Kaiser Special, I guess it was. But Frazer made another, same car, different grille on it, a little more upscale. So that's why it was Kaiser Frazer. Yeah. They got into an argument in 1951, those two, and Frazer left. And he had a car that he was producing, 1951 Frazer, and there were 20,000 orders that were never filled for that car because he had taken off, and Henry Kaiser decided to rename the company Kaiser Motors. So much for the Frazer. By the way, this is a model of a Kaiser. This little guy here is a 1953 Kaiser. Might want to look at that on the way out. The got all things that move in it. No, nice little car. However, they never offered a V8 engine. They didn't have enough money to do that, and because of that, Ford and all the others came by with V8s, and the advertising was all about speed and power, and it pretty well won the day. Yeah, Dean.
Probably in 1949 or 50, I think he did the first hatchback.
He did, and it was
Sedan.
called
It had tailgate,
yeah.
and the
He
right
did.
rear door did not open. It was welded shut because the spare tire was
That's right.
mounted on.
Yeah, see, we have somebody who. That was called the Kaiser Traveler.
Right.
It was the trunk pulled out and the top went up. It was, some people called it the first half hatchback. But yes, that was an odd-looking thing.
Do you remember if the seats folded or you had to take them out to PlayStation?
Seats,
like
they did not fold as far as I know.
Take them out.
But they did have a back door that was welded shut.
Yeah.
You're correct. Ben?
I think you were starting to answer this, or partly answering this, talking about the V8s. How his undercapitalization ended up driving him out, why he couldn't find a specialty niche, just because the market went on toward power and he didn't have the ability to gear up for that? Or?
Yes, everything in the auto business cost a tremendous amount of money. If you wanted to put a new doodad here or there, it just took a tremendous amount of money invested with suppliers and with manufacturing engineers to actually get it in. He didn't have enough money to compete with others who were offering features much faster. He didn't. Now, his motors were actually contracted from a firm in Detroit called Continental Motors. They made motors for tractors. So his motor was actually an adaptation of a forklift truck, which was another kind of chin and a blow to the ego. But they dressed it up a little bit, but it was only 6 cylinders, and he did not have the money for an 8. That car was actually built big enough to fit an 8, but he couldn't purchase enough of them. And the other thing he did, the engineers did not know enough. to handle an automatic transmission, so he bought those. He bought them from Oldsmobile. And when General Motors saw Kaiser coming up in the rearview mirror, they weren't too willing to sell him transmissions. So he began to be squeezed. You know, they sold him some, but the delivery was a little late, and the price was a little high, and et cetera. It was pretty clear that he didn't have a lot of friends in Detroit. Ken?
In solving the problem of capital being undercapitalized, his competitors solved that problem by selling stock, going public. He never did. He kept it private the whole time.
No, he had 2 stock offerings.
He did.
He went to an investment bank the first time, and he got, matter of fact, I have pictures of that I should show you. He got a nice investment. I was probably $40 or $50 million from that. And he wanted to go a second time, and the investment banks were leery about that. It's because he just didn't seem to have the numbers, and they saw the others, you know, gearing up their models. By 48, 49, I don't know if you remember the 49 Ford, but it was a big hit. You know, it is a very attractive car for many people. And Kaiser in 49 didn't even have new models. So they didn't want to issue any more stock. So he couldn't go to the market. He did try to go to the government. And now this is interesting. I didn't cover this, but the government said, okay, we'll lend you money, but you have to make a little car. You can't make a big car because the government says these cars are too big for the missus who's at home driving around grocery store and whatnot. So he did design a small car, and it was called the Henry J. I don't know if you remember that, but that car was launched in '51, and it was not a hit.
With government funding?
It did, yes, yeah. But he paid back the government every penny.
A la Coca.
Yes.
Who also came out with a small car in that time.
Yeah, but people weren't interested in small cars. He even had a 4-cylinder and a 6-cylinder engine in it. But the look of it was frumpy. The interior was Spartan. And his wife, Bess, said, this doesn't look good. You know, and Henry said, I don't have any more money. And he went out with that, and she said, women won't buy it, and they didn't. They didn't even have a trunk lid. You had to pull down the back seat to put the groceries in this little cave. Wasn't going to work. You don't know women.
Henry J. was also sold by Sears as an Allstate.
Sold by Sears as an Allstate car.
Was that a last-ditch effort?
Yeah. Yeah, another distribution channel. Yeah. It was in the Sears catalog. You can buy, well, you can buy a house.
Downtown.
You know.
Joe.
Yeah, did he have to deal with the UAW much? Because
He did.
in the 1950s.
Matter of fact, one of the lasting tributes to him, if you go to the UAW headquarters in Washington, D.C., there's quotes up there from Henry Kaiser. He's on their royal list as being one of the people they really highly admire because he was very friendly with unions. He actually agreed with unions. As long as you had money coming in and you had a pay scale that you could afford, which he did because there was a lot of government contracting, they also liked him because of health care. The health care plan that that has his name, Kaiser Permanente, was actually developed by a doctor whose name was Sidney Garfield. And Garfield had started out in Southern California. Kaiser learned about him, took him up to his dam building projects, where Garfield kind of came up with this scheme of paying some money every month and then having health care prepaid, having doctors on staff, having equipment and so on. And that whole idea of that kind of health plan came from Garfield through Kaiser, but it bore Kaiser's name because Kaiser was the guy who put a lot of money into it. The unions like that too. So their members were treated pretty well by him. Bob.
And in preparation for this, I looked up Kaiser on YouTube, found that he was on in 1957, What's My Line? I made the panelists put the masks on, you can find this yourself. Nobody got it, but one of the questions that the panelists asked was, will you be renowned? Will you go down in history as known for something. And there was a question whether he would, but Bennett Cerf, the head of the show, said, yeah. So when they unmasked, Arlene Francis, I think we said, she said, oh, you will be renowned because of your charity, which you did not mention. And I see there an elitist bias to you, because you've mentioned for-profit enterprises, and I guess the Hoover Dam is still working today.
Very well.
That continue to benefit us. The Liberty ships were part of the war effort. There's no question there.
Bob's going to do the second half of the lecture here.
His question is, don't you think I'm right?
No, the question is, didn't you focus mainly on his for-profit enterprises?
Yes.
You didn't even mention his charity that followed after.
Well, I'm glad you did. I couldn't cover his whole life in this period. We have people walking out of here, with that. But let me say something about that.
I'm making a different point that you're making. He's renowned for his profit-making enterprises, hugely capitalist, that benefited the people, the world.
2 comments on it. I know exactly the what's my line you're talking about. John Charles Daly wasn't there that day. Bennett Cerf was there, and Arlene Francis with her glittery mask. Yep. And Kaiser with his deep, rough voice. He was no glory in appearance. They didn't know who he was. And that was only 3 years after he quit the automobile business. So my point is, he's just not that well known. And secondly, his first son, Henry Kaiser Jr., died prematurely of multiple sclerosis. His second son, Edgar, lived until he was about 69. But I think Henry was very stricken by the death of the son that had his name. And you can see pictures if you go through Kaiser Permanente files of him with little children and in little 1940s type wheelchairs, which are so different than today. These little kids in there, they had some birth defect or something, and he was very compassionate toward them. So he was really interested in healthcare. And his whole Kaiser Permanente now is, well, it's what, 6, 7, 8 states in the West, and back here in the East and the Midwest, there are also plans with Kaiser Permanente. They carried on his concern for the well-being of people. And that's what a lot of his money went for. Jack.
Didn't finish 8th grade, I think.
Didn't finish 8th grade.
What do you know about his attitude toward education? Did he encourage other people to advance their education? Was he engaged in education in any way?
Not that I know of, Jack. I've not read that. I don't think he had a pejorative attitude toward education. But he was a let's do it and let's do it now type. We can do it. He had a very strong will to proceed in almost any direction, and it wasn't sitting in a classroom. So I'm not sure that came up on a scale too high, but and he didn't talk much about it. Yeah. That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about that. Yeah. You can still buy a Kaiser car, by the way. If you go to YouTube and look up 1953 Kaiser Manhattan, you can find one on Long Island for sale. It's only about $65,000. If you're looking for one, I decided the model was enough for me. My dear wife had some other thoughts about what we should do with $65,000, and I didn't buy the car. So, listen, thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad you came. Thanks very much, Caitlin. Thanks very much, Karina, for your video work. Thank you, Jenna, for changing the slides, and thank all of you. Thank you, Benjamin, for allowing this time. So thank all of you for coming. I'm humbled. I appreciate it.